Welcome to the Thinking Expansively seminar series. Known as TESS Talks, this series offers ways of thinking beyond normative sites and forms of knowledge by starting from elsewhere in a way that unsettles and reconfigures knowledge. Thinking expansively redefines how we approach knowledge, pushing us to imagine and realize a more equitable and inhabitable world. TESS Talk is an interdisciplinary online series hosted by GCSJ, the Centre for Global Challenges and Social Justice at the Open University. Today, our speaker is Dr. Rovinser Najuma from Edinburgh University, UK. Rovinser is a lecturer of digital education and Global South. Her work is underpinned in systems thinking, learning theories, emerging technologies, and intersectionality. Endeared by the potential of technologies to empower and leverage access, her current work focuses on possibilities for multi-tiered systems of support for access and participation for marginalized population. Her talk today reflects this ongoing work.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Gunjan. Thank you. And I welcome you all to this session or TESS seminar on imagining an integrated system of support for enabling access and transition to and through higher education. I should say a little bit about my interest in this area. First of all, growing up in post-conflict Uganda Central region, it is a kind of forgotten conflict, though it took about 6 years that brought the current government in power. But then after that conflict in the central part of the country, we had conflict in northern Uganda that took about 16 years, and the cessation of hostilities happened in 2006. And right immediately after that 2006, I started my doctoral studies to study post-conflict education by looking at learning and participation in primary schools. So this took me to northern Uganda to see how children were participating and learning after the cessation of hostilities. And then I was based at the University of Birmingham, undertaking my doctoral studies, but doing field work in northern Uganda. And it was quite an interesting period for me and learning journey. And also my work, I think, really traverses across the sectors, being a primary teacher educator, training teachers who are going to teach in primary schools, in primary teacher training colleges, but also as a teacher educator at a university. I think my work then has traversed all the sectors of education, primary, secondary, and higher education, but with a specific interest into what happens in terms of the pedagogical practice in the classrooms, and at the same time, what happens in terms of curriculum design and development, in terms of enabling all the learners to participate, in effect, to have inclusive and democratic pedagogy. But taking a tilt a bit, increasingly, the teacher trainees that I had been training, right from those who are going to teach in the primary schools to the secondary schools, were always encountering refugee learners in their classrooms. And we needed to do something. And this is where now my study then got directed from learning and participation in the classroom to how do they come to join the schools? How do refugee learners join the primary schools? How do refugee learners join secondary schools? And then from secondary schools, how do they then transition to higher education? And therefore, across this, I just see quite a lot of issues to do with access, issues to do with meaningful participation after access, and issues to do with transition to and through after the university. And of course, there are several transitional requirements for a refugee learner to join a primary school, to join a secondary school, or to join a higher education institution. And by higher education institution here, I broadly mean including those tertiary education institutions, vocational, business, and technical, and the like. I use higher education really as an encompassing term. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. This is what we want to work towards, meeting this pledge of the 15% by 2030, increasing the percentage of refugee student populations, refugee youth that can access higher education and that do access higher education to 15% by 2030. Of course, rising from 1% of 2019 to 6% in 2002. There is progress, but the progress is slow. And in as much as now there is a broader and bigger global movement to engage various actors to support higher education institutions, especially in refugee hosting countries, the average of the numbers of refugee youth that access higher education are still low. Next. And of course, when I talk about the access to higher education in refugee hosting countries, well aware of the other refugee hosting countries in the global north with connotations to the term. So, of course, Germany hosts quite a number of them, as you can see, even other countries, and in the UK here, of course. But then I'm referring to countries, refugee hosting countries in the global south. And of course, here I mean my research has, for much of the time, focused on Uganda as a field site for the different empirical studies that I have undertaken. And majority of the refugee population or the refugee students that come to Uganda are coming from Southern Sudan, are coming from the DRC, Congo, used to come from Rwanda, others coming from Burundi, and creating a complexity and confluence of requirements across languages of instruction, because as you can know, some of the students would be speaking French, coming from French-speaking countries, other coming from Arabic-speaking countries, and yet in Uganda, the language of instruction is English. And therefore, having different populations, home countries of refugee students also would become an issue in terms of the language to use, in terms of enabling access. And there are other issues. And therefore, our research highlights that current support systems in higher education are generic, short-term, and pay less attention to these intersectional and compound disadvantages for refugee learners. And the need to reimagine and, get more envisioned about then what forms and kinds of support are relevant and might give an effective or more impact in terms of access. Next. And in order to undertake this reimagination, then we need to draw evidence about what works to promote access, what works to promote meaningful participation once the refugee learners have accessed higher education, but at the same time, what works to facilitate transition to and through higher education. And already provided the context of this work. Next. And very well, as you are aware, many of you will note that there are quite a number of studies that have highlighted barriers and challenges for refugee learners to access higher education in a number of reviews. And at the same time, there are several studies that have explored the experiences, student experiences for refugee learners in terms of their integration, in terms of their acculturation, in terms of their participation, and so on. But what is limited is that kind of evidence on support measures and initiatives to widen access and facilitate meaningful participation, especially in global South refugee hosting countries. There's quite a lot of evidence and literature from the global North, but it is quite limited for refugee hosting countries and from refugee hosting institutions, higher education institutions in the global South. And this creates a gap in terms of mapping the refugee learning ecosystems that are required to be developed, supported, and facilitated such that we can support this meaningful access, participation, and transition. And of course, we very well know of how there are several researches that point to the super disadvantage. And a few of them highlight those, how we can overcome the super disadvantage in terms of host countries that are in the global south, and in terms of, and providing kinds of integrated refugee learning ecosystems. And therefore, next. And therefore, we undertook to go a bit all over, across different, by all over, I mean to go beyond the usual blue sky studies that are undertaken on refugee work. Together with my colleague then at Makerere University, we visited several refugee camps in Uganda to try and understand how refugee students, and first of all, refugee learners that were youth and wanted to access Makerere University and other higher education institutions. So we made several field visits to the different refugee camps where the student populations, where we saw the youth that wanted to access higher education were coming from. Next. And then we started to undertake interviews and engagements with refugee student leaders. Once the refugee students have access to higher education, one of the important groups really to engage with are the refugee student leaders. And therefore, we also convened and facilitated today, I could call them higher education ecosystem diagnostic workshops, to borrow healthy language, to try and understand and analyze the kinds of challenges, barriers, and enablers. We call them ecosystem because in this understanding of the barriers and challenges, we so much wanted also to understand the linked stakeholders that could support and enable kinds of solutions. And therefore, while engaging in the interviews with the student leaders, we also ask them about the possible stakeholders and the possible actors with whom they have already worked with whom they want to work with, and those that they think need to be doing something and doing more. For example, stakeholders like national higher education accreditation bodies, stakeholders like National Examination Board. On the surface, you might think that, oh, we just need them to have translated documents. But when there is an educational information system and these students are not recorded in that system within the Global South, it would mean, and in other contexts, it would mean the exclusion has already started. So as you are engaging with facilitating access and transition to higher education, the earlier documentation that is required to access does not appear already in the system that is supposed to forward the names of the students. And therefore, we so much wanted to understand also with this line of understanding the challenges, but also to understand the relevant, the would-be, and then the stakeholders that are not doing, either doing their job or need to do more, and also try to understand what do they need to know such that they are able to do what we would anticipate them to do. So we developed also stakeholder mapping and stakeholder maps. From these ecosystem diagnostic workshops, we also developed systemograms that we would later on share with development partners like USAID, the Norwegian Refugee Councils, and the like, such that a complete picture is being brought out and about beyond the refugee students. And therefore, in that, we also identified kinds of system pivots where within the higher education system, where within the different actor network, where are the leverage points? What are kinds of those pain points that need to be addressed such that we can have meaningful access and we can have parity at access, at the same time meaningful participation and transition to and through higher education. Next. And of course, in terms of engaging with student leaders, again, several countries, as I have seen, and in many other host countries, the refugee engagement forums have been very good forums to engage with as both researchers and practitioners to try and understand how these kinds of what works are being conceived and also connected to ministries' technical working groups. So if engagement with refugee working forums also would allow also a link and connection to technical working groups within different ministries, then you would begin to see some bit of broader mobilization and engagement and broader thinking about the kinds of support beyond just maybe teaching only language or only focusing on the papers, and to think broader thinking about the multi-systemic support. So also other methods and approaches have been to those higher education institutions, of course, within the country that are offering access and support programs. And you will note that many higher education institutions, not all higher education institutions have an open door for refugee learners. And therefore, it was interesting to visit these higher education institutions that are offering support to refugee learners to try and understand what kind of support they're offering. But at the same time, I think at another level, we might need to go to those that are not offering access so that we can learn why they are not offering us access and their anticipations or fears and threats for it, and whether there are any kinds of possibilities that are likely to be undertaken. Next. And then in terms of other methods and approaches that we have undertaken in this research, and this research really has taken about, I think it's now over 6 years, also practical engagement and involvement with policy actors who we would normally invite to speak to refugee students, we'd invite them to speak to university actors, we would invite them to speak to the refugee engagement forums. Like there is when we would identify that the issue has to do with refugee permits, and therefore the university has nothing or little to do about it, then you need to engage with the ministry in charge of offering refugee permits to students before they can receive a national identity card. And therefore, bringing these policy actors together in these kinds of systems thinking workshops enabled a kind of multi-sectoral engagement that would allow stakeholders to look at these different issues in one room, but in a way that looks for solutions to addressing them, such that when you address one issue, then the next day the student is not affected by another issue that is away out of reach for them. And therefore, this also enabled us to generate more data again on the kinds of actions for policy actors in the different line ministries on what needs to be done. And then further at the little end of the study, then we focused more on undertaking detailed case studies in the different institutions that are offering support. Next. And what have been our findings? Well, our findings have led us to several things. And of course, one of them was earlier highlighted, that the various institutions that were offering support kind of focused on non-targeted support. For example, you would find that the refugee students, some of the refugee students coming from the different host countries have different needs, but all will be lumped up together and only taught English. And yet some would have probably come earlier and had studied English, but then because it is the English language that is on offer, the course, then they would all come and take that. You would find that there are those that are experiencing challenges in accessing an online application and need a cave, an internet cave, and somebody to enable them to fill an online application. And that would be addressed by a different kind of actor. Others would be they require kinds of permits. Others would be looking towards this meaningful participation once they have joined the universities, and therefore have feelings of isolation, having feelings of discrepancy in understanding the academic language. So the various needs required different support actions and interventions, yet there are few tailored and targeted interventions that could work in a kind of ecosystem that from stage A, this is done, stage B, this is done, this is stage C, addressing these different needs at different points in time. And therefore, we then recommend that there is need for these kinds of systems thinking approaches to use systems thinking approaches and tools to understand the problems in their holistic nature, such that we do not address one problem at the other end and then access, participation, and transition is affected by a different problem. And of course, to issues of application of intersectionality in the analysis and development of these different support measures, such that issues of gender, issues to do with what kinds of ages that we are focusing to, aware that when we are talking about access, national governments usually also have what ages they consider for the different kinds of access, either to primary schools, to secondary schools, and then to universities. But you will find that majority of the refugee learners that are seeking to join higher education are for mature age entry, and therefore require kind of adult learner pedagogies that would allow them to access higher education. And to other issues of post-digital thinking, where interventions with and without technology or that consciously use technology to address access issues are enabled. For example, you would find that many of the universities that refugee learners want to access the applications for admissions are online. And if somebody doesn't have a meal, or they don't have a appropriate shelter, or they have issues, they don't have somewhere to leave the child so that they can go to an internet cave, then they cannot be able to fill in the application form. Other issues would have to do with the language of the language of the country. Other issues have to do with whether when I'm in the classroom, whether when I'm in the lecture room, I'm able to participate. And to issues, to recommendations on aspects of co-creation of solutions, where if we want to develop any interventions, whether they are language, whether they are interventions that address issues to do with applications, whether if there are interventions to do with meaningful participation within the universities once they have accessed, or whether there are interventions that have to do with preparations for transition from the university. In as much as universities have centers that some of the universities have centers that prepare students that want to transition, that are about to transition from university, in terms of preparing them for the labor market, in terms of preparing them either for postgraduate education. Even at this level, the refugee learners would be requiring those kinds of support interventions that are localized to their needs, because definitely even at the transition level, they do experience various unique transitional needs that would require to be addressed. And much of all, you would note that much of the funding usually for scholarships then ends at the end of the study period, and therefore the transition period also becomes a quite critical phase for the learners in this kind of category, and therefore wanting to co-create solutions with refugee student leaders, co-creating solutions with refugee learners, co-creating solutions with those kinds of the sector ministries and technical working groups that are in charge of these different areas of support would be very useful, rather than this kinds of siloed development of interventions, where you would find that actors within the higher education sector only address and develop their solutions and then implement them. And then midway in the implementation, you would find that the intervention addresses maybe only 10% of the needs. And also the need to strengthen the use of course, digital technologies and the generation of data to facilitate knowledge sharing. Many institutions of higher education are implementing quite good programs, but because these programs, they do not share about what they offer to one another, so it becomes a kind of complex environment that there is limited learning from institution to institution, limited learning from the actors themselves. And then you find a duplication of services, a duplication of interventions, and then also the kinds of limited data and evidence. Noting that where there is limited data and evidence, you'll find that there is policy invisibility, where institutions do not record refugee learners in terms of their respective categories, and having also within the national governments and ministries having data about refugee learner populations within the country. It becomes a complex issue when it comes to budgeting within technical working groups, when it comes to planning for higher education institutions, even when it comes to kind of following up how the support and interventions have been able to be implemented. At the same time, I am aware of many instances when refugee learners would not want to be entered in an institutional databases as refugee learners, and at other instances you would find that institutions have categorized them as international students and therefore required to pay as international students. And these kinds of either lack of data or data that is not accurate, and at the same time issues to do with low capacities for the use of digital technologies, and issues of what kinds of digital technologies would be required to support these different interventions, such that there is, first of all, this parity in kind of access, and at the same time to enable the meaningful participation, even on course platforms, meaningful participation, on peer group platforms, meaningful participation in undertaking much of the course activities and participating in the higher education institutions life broadly. Taking note that higher education is not only about the attainment of the qualification, but there are other broader purposes of higher education, which you would want that refugee learners are also able to achieve in terms of socialization, in terms of becoming active citizens, and also in terms of achieving the kinds of qualifications and the learnifications that are required. And we have been able to have some of the knowledge products and with my colleagues. And of course, I should express that these studies we have been undertaking them with colleagues from Accra University. Next, Dr. Rebecca Nambi, with whom we have, next slide, with whom we have co-authored papers. And then Dr. Rebecca Nambi there, we co-authored a paper on bidi creativity, where we were looking at the kinds of liminality of inclusion for refugee learners in the use of technology. Another paper where we co-authored it with Dr. Michael Gallagher and of course with Rebecca in terms of the institutional practices of non-educational actors and social networks. And I think we have about other forthcoming knowledge products that are coming on. Thank you so much, and that's the work so far.
Thank you for watching this TESS talk. Please visit our website to learn more about the series and GCSJ. Please subscribe to this channel and follow us on social media to keep up to date on future events. The details of those are in the description. Once again, thank you for watching.